And it's week 8. We are 2/3 of the way through the football schedule of the 2013 calendar. And tonight we had two big matchups in the Big South Conference that we were anxiously awaiting. And unfortunately for us, the two classic tilts on the gridiron that we thought we were going to see this evening, they were anything but that, as we had two clubs that had big homecoming games. One took care of business. One was not able to. Hi, folks. Brian Rushing here. You are with me on GastonGazette.com. We're going to be waiting on WGNC 1450 to come back to us after they finish the Behind Enemy Lines postgame show. From what I understand, Jeff Ward's trying to tie that up right now. Once they do that, we'll get them back on board and we'll reset everything here in the studio at the Gaston Gazette. What was I talking about in regards to the two games in the Big South Conference? Well, Lake Norman Charter had a week off this week in the conference. So it came down to the 6 teams that right now are part of Gaston County and 3 games that had some importance to it. Certainly we're going to talk a little bit about Huss and East Gaston. Huss came that close from beating South Point on Huss's homecoming in a game that would have been a huge, huge game for Huss had they been able to pull it off. And, of course, the controversy that took place, was he in, was he not in? Folks, the reality is it is what it is from the scoreboard. The referee said that he was not in, Carry-On Moore, not in the end zone, so South Point walks away by the skin of their teeth with a 28-27 win in overtime over Huss. So Huss, the question was this going to stunt the growth of the Huskies moving forward, or was this going to create for them a scenario to where they were going to build some momentum off of this near win and really put it on East Gaston? And as we can tell from tonight's score, they were able to really lay it on East Gaston. They really took it out on the Warriors this evening, winning 41-7. But, of course, the two main games in the Big South Conference, if you're looking to separate the wheat from the tares when it comes to the Big South Conference standings, you had to put your attention in Dallas and in Belmont tonight. And certainly the folks in Dallas were revved up for a big, big game against Forest View. It was homecoming night. I was there this afternoon. I had the pleasure of emceeing the pep rally there for North Gaston, was excited to do so, and those kids were amped up. It was an unbelievable scene this afternoon at North Gaston High School, and because of that, you really thought that North Gaston might come into this game focused. They had just lost their first game of the year a week ago to Ashbrook 35-14, and essentially that game there was nothing more than Ashbrook making some adjustments and getting out to a lead and taking care of business and getting the win in the second half, 35-14 over North Gaston. We are. Wait, Carson, if you'll just go ahead and give me the signal whenever WGNC joins in with us here on the Gaston Gazette WGNC postgame show, driven proudly by Tyndall Ford Subaru here in Gastonia. I mentioned North Gaston. One of the things that was going to be a major bugaboo for North Gaston, as has probably been in historic terms for North Gaston, is the inability this team has had to tackle in the open field. And a part of that was taking place last week. A little bit of it reared its ugly head against Ashbrook in the 35-14 loss, and clearly the final result tonight, a 55-22 drubbing by the Jaguars of the Wildcats, just shows just how dynamic the Forest View offense is this evening, and how still North Gaston, though vastly improved in the big scope of the Big South Conference, still has some work to do. Now, of course, they're going to go next week, I believe, outside of the conference to take on Chase, which the final 4 weeks of their schedule is actually one that they can build some momentum in as they try to make themselves ready for a playoff push. They'll take on Chase. That's a winnable game. They'll take on East Gaston, another winnable game, I believe. Then they'll take on South Point. We all know how the South Point team is going, and we're going to talk more about them in just a little bit. I certainly anticipate that being a loss for the Wildcats. But then they finish up against Lake Norman Charter. There's a real strong possibility that North Gaston, 5-2 at this point, finishes out the year winning 3 out of 4. Do the math, folks. That ends up, if I'm not mistaken, an 8-3 record on the season. And if anybody would have said that this football team would have won 8 games to begin the year, really wouldn't have bought into it. I know that there was a possibility of it happening, but by virtue of them playing so well in the first 4 weeks of the season, for them to go 8-3 is a real possibility now. However, the way that this conference is going to stack up in the Big South was based on how they were going to play against Huss, Forest View, and Ashbrook. And now we've seen it. The 3 weeks that North Gaston's season was going to be the telltale of how they were going to do in the conference has essentially already been told. They defeated Huss, played a very solid game there against a team that in Huss was still trying to find its identity a little bit. They took Huss on, they beat Huss, they then lose to Ashbrook last week in convincing fashion, and then they got pummeled this week, period, by Forest View. I think the numbers are going to tell the tale for Forest View, to where the offense was just absolutely insane. I know that we keep bringing this up, but it seems like every time we mention the numbers that Forest View puts up offensively, they keep topping it. This team was coming in, thanks Carson, this team was coming in to tonight's action averaging 51.8 points per game. They upped it. Now granted, it was by a fraction, but when you put 55 points on a board in a homecoming game against a team that is one of the biggest surprises in Western North Carolina, much less the Gazette viewing and listening area, it's pretty unbelievable the way that this Forest View offense works night in and night out. It's somebody else making a big contribution, and then, oh yeah, forget about Logan Bradley. 23 of 33 on the night in the air, 340 yards, 6 touchdowns, 1 pick. That is an unbelievable number that he put up tonight against a team that was really wanting to show the Big South Conference that they could play at that upper level. Unfortunately for North Gaston, Logan Bradley took those guys out into space and picked them apart this evening. And now it brings to mind a question of, we saw what happened tonight with Ashbrook and South Point. I went live. I wanted to see South Point live and in person. And I got to tell you something, folks. I've been to a lot of college football games. I've been to a lot of high school football games. And I'll be honest with you, there are a lot of small colleges in the NCAA landscape that don't do college football nearly as well as South Point does high school football. It is an absolute unbelievable thing the way they are able to do Friday nights in Belmont. By the way, I want to welcome everybody that's listening on 1450 AM. You are tuning in as you're catching up with us. I'm Brian Rushing. This is the Gaston Gazette WGNC postgame show, driven proudly by Tyndall Ford Subaru here in Gastonia. The way that South Point does football night in and night out, I've got to be honest with you, there are more workers and volunteers at South Point games than you see at a lot of small 1A football games that are showing up to watch the game. Those in attendance are outnumbered by the amount of workers and staff that South Point puts on week after week, which makes it, without question, in the Gazette area, the best football experience in all the area. Sorry, I know that there are some up-and-comers. I know that there are some folks that really do it well. Nobody does it better than this group. Just the things that they are able to do on a nightly basis before the game, with the band, the pageantry, the way that they acknowledge the folks that have come before this team that's on the field. They honored the 10th anniversary of the 2003 championship team tonight. A real great touch. The way they do homecoming. It's an elaborate, festive event, and it's like that all the time. And the place was absolutely packed. There are people standing on the track. There are people up on the hill. The way it reminds me is, it really reminds me of what Ashbrook football was like back in the mid-'80s, back when all of those good teams came through as things were starting to tail off just at the end of the junior hall era, going into where I went into high school. At that point, things started to tail off. But in its day, in the mid-'80s, the Ashbrook experience was as good as anything that you were going to get back then. Watching Jesse James and all of those guys do what it is that they do. South Point has replicated that and maybe even then some. I don't know if they can actually handle at that campus the same amount of people that you would see when Ashbrook would take on Huss or when Ashbrook would take on Greensboro Page and all those epic playoff battles that they would have. But the reality is that South Point, the biggest thing that they lack is more space. There are neighborhoods growing around them. There are folks parking in front of parking spaces where people have parked. I saw one guy tonight drove his car off the curb, like literally down into an embankment, because everything's just so tight. And they have to be so proud of what it is that they developed there. I got to be honest with you, from a marketing and promotion standpoint, I'm extremely jealous because they just do it so doggone well. And speaking of well, the game tonight cleared something up for me. South Point has the best defense in this area, bar none. Now, saying that, I looked at this Ashbrook club tonight, and I saw a good defense. I saw a good defense last week against North Gaston, and this is a club that flies to the ball and is extremely athletic. However, South Point's that much more athletic. The reality is South Point got a taste of what the spread offense is like with Ashbrook, and Ashbrook sputtered and faltered in the first half. I saw the first 6 possessions for Ashbrook. They had 4 punts, 1 interception. They did get a touchdown on a very short field after a kickoff return. It was just a very solid job for South Point. I think that especially after watching the last couple of weeks, both on the scoreboard, on tape, live and in person, South Point's offense is actually a step or two behind their defense. It's almost impenetrable. The only way that South Point has any opportunity of being beaten, yes, Carson, I said impenetrable, the only way that South Point can consistently get beaten on the defensive end is if you allow them to have a very short field. Now, you throw in the dynamic that comes from Forest View and their ability to throw under zones, to throw over the top on the corners, and to really spread things out to give their specialty players open spaces to run to. It's going to create an interesting dynamic for what's going to happen next Friday night at Forest View. Folks, this is going to be an unbelievable matchup between Forest View and South Point, and we're going to talk more about that a little bit later on. Yes, I'm going to do my due diligence, Carson, especially as we get you in here in the hot seat for the 3 and out as we get toward the tail end of the show. But in essence tonight, and certainly with Cliff Dixon here, I don't know if you saw him, we're going to talk about the Forest View North Gaston game. I was not at that game. I was at the South Point Ashbrook game. We're definitely going to get Cliff's takes on what he saw and just the evolution of this Forest View offense and how it looks like compared to weeks ago, and then even to the beginning of the year when this club lost, I believe the score is 57-56 to Nation Ford. They gave up 57 points. The defense has improved, no question about it. However, the offense hasn't missed a beat. The offense has been unbelievable. They're now going to be over 52 points a game on average. That's an unbelievable number. South Point, against a good defense tonight, put up 48 against Ashbrook. We'll talk about all that and more. This is the opening segment of the Gaston Gazette WGNC postgame show, proudly driven by Tyndall Ford Subaru. We'll be right back in just a bit.